As an ideology, romance is dangerous. Seriously, it can kill you. Take a small wedding that took place in rural Millinocket, Maine on August 7th of this year. 62 guests are now responsible for at least 178 cases of COVID, and 7 of those people are now dead. How, you ask, could someone risk killing others just to have their dream wedding? I don't think it was selfishness per se, but a deep and abiding cultural belief that having the perfect romance, the perfect proposal, the perfect wedding, the perfect honeymoon will lead to a safe and secure future. And during COVID and the economic and environmental collapse of 2020, who doesn't want a safe and secure future?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Rachel Edens, and I am a program officer with the Vermont Humanities Council. And I would like to welcome you to our December digital talk for our first Wednesday series with Laurie Essig, professor from Middlebury College, who will be bringing us her talk, Love, Inc., Dating Apps, the Big White Wedding, and Chasing the Happily Ever After. Before we begin, I just want to thank our partners and underwriters for this program. First of all, the Vermont Department of Libraries and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Our partners, Middlebury College and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And at this time, I'd just like to share a little bit about Laurie, and then I'll turn it over to her. Laurie Essig is a professor and director of gender, sexuality, and feminist studies at Middlebury College. She is a sociologist who teaches and writes about how power shapes our bodies and our desires. Her first book, Queer in Russia, A Story of Sex, Self, and the Other, from Duke, 1999, considered how sexual others are imagined and thus imagine themselves in Russia. Her second book, American Plastic, Credit Cards, Boob Jobs, and Our Quest for Perfection, from Beacon, 2010, argued that cosmetic surgery in the United States is the subprime mortgage crisis of the body, with corporations squeezing profit from working class Americans who hope to have a more perfect body that will lead to a more perfect future. Her recent book, Love, Inc., Dating Apps, The Big White Wedding, and Chasing the Happily Never After, from UC Press, 2019, argues that romance as an ideology became even more powerful in the last few decades, even as actual marriage rates declined. Romance promises us a safe and secure future as a private love affair, even as our future is more and more precarious. Rather than demanding the necessary political and structural changes today for a secure tomorrow, we are too busy reading romance novels, obsessing over royal weddings, or swiping through our dating apps to pay much attention to the world around us. Essig has written for a variety of publications, including The Washington Post, The New York Times, The Conversation, and Ms. Magazine. We are delighted to welcome Laurie Essig with us this evening. Laurie, I'll let you go from there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel, for that introduction. That was great. So 2020 has been a year, and there are so many real and scary problems that we need to focus on, like COVID and a possible coup. So what kind of cold-hearted and seriously mean person would want to take apart romance? After all, romance gives us hope in hopeless times, a belief that things could get better if we just found the one, and then we would be safe and secure in our own happily ever after. Well, the kind of cold-hearted and seriously mean person who would argue that romance is a serious problem and we should be paying attention to it is me. I was not born a cynic. Like many of you, I grew up on Disney and dreams of a big white wedding and riding off into the sunset. But about 25 years ago, I started teaching a course as a very young professor on the sociology of heterosexuality. And then I spent about 6 years writing this book, Love, Inc. In the course of the research for this book, I interviewed more than 170 people planning their weddings or on a honeymoon at Disney or at the royal wedding of Kate and William. I also collected a variety of cultural texts, from 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight to YouTube marriage proposals with tens of millions of views, and reality TV shows like Say Yes to the Dress. All of this, teaching the course and researching the book, has taught me a few things about romance, a few facts to which attention must be paid. The first fact is that romance is an ideology. It stops us from seeing what's really going on. It covers things in fairy dust and keeps us from understanding how things really are. Ideology, as Marx taught us, is, quote, the ideas of the ruling class are the ruling ideas. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, end quote. Or in Louise Althusser's language, there is a romantic imaginary, and it separates us from the real. If religion was the pre-modern opiate of the masses, according to Marx, then according to me, romance is modernity's far more addictive heroin. Which brings us to the next fact. As an ideology, romance is dangerous. Seriously, it can kill you. Take a small wedding that took place in rural Millinocket, Maine on August 7th of this year. 62 guests are now responsible for at least 178 cases of COVID, and 7 of those people are now dead. How, you ask, could someone risk killing others just to have their dream wedding? I don't think it was selfishness per se, but a deep and abiding cultural belief that having the perfect romance, the perfect proposal, the perfect wedding, the perfect honeymoon will lead to a safe and secure future. And during COVID and the economic and environmental collapse of 2020, who doesn't want a safe and secure future? But how did we start to believe this? When did our culture produce this ideology of romance? Which brings me to my next fact. Romance is thoroughly modern. It only started about 175 years ago. I know you're thinking I'm wrong. After all, people had deep and abiding romantic feelings before 1850. It's true, Romeo and Juliet, or A Lady and Her Knight in Shining Armor were important stories people told. But if you think about the sort of pre-modern attachment, it never promised a safe and secure future. You might recall that Romeo and Juliet did not end well, and the lady was usually married to the knight's lord. In fact, all that romance promised before modernity was a whole lot of drama. As Anthony Giddens puts it in his book, The Transformation of Intimacy, romantic love became distinct from passion somewhere in the late 18th century. Unlike passion, which uproots erratically, romantic love detaches individuals from wider social circumstances, end quote. It's this detaching the couple from wider social circumstances that allows modern romance to promise a happily ever after. What changed sometime in the 1800s was this idea that we would meet the one, and then because of that, have a safe and secure future. Which brings me to our next fact. Romance is intimately tied up with capitalism. I would date the start of modern romance somewhere around 1850, probably about the time that this woman, Esther Howland, started mass producing Valentine's Day cards in Worcester, Massachusetts. Although never married herself, Howland's Valentine's Day cards represent the most important fact we need to know about our modern notions of romantic love. It was born alongside capitalism. It's not that capitalism invented romance, nor that romance created capitalism. It's just that the two were so good together, the perfect couple. Ever since Ms. Howland started her business, capitalism and romance have been in bed together. In 2019, Americans spent about $145 per person for a total of $19 billion on Valentine's Day. And this was up from the previous year, despite the fact that there was a cooling global economy. And in the US, we were feeling the financial effects of the longest federal shutdown in US history. Not only did romance as we know it begin with capitalism, it also began with a modern nation state. Which leads us to our next fact. The state controls romance. As historian Nancy Cott has explained, the US government became increasingly involved in regulating intimate relationships in the 1800s, so that by the end of the Civil War, the US government began to see the control of marriage as central to its control of the country. This newfound state interest in marriage and citizenship also led to an increased policing of relationships outside of legal marriage. Rather than priests and rabbis, Victorian legislators and reformers, as well as a burgeoning mass media, began to create new rules for romance. Victorians passed laws about commercial sex, homosexual acts, age of consent, and who could get married. Which brings us to our next fact. Love is a battlefield. Victorian sciences, especially sexology, marked certain sexual acts as racially degenerate, specifically because they indicated a lack of a clear and hierarchical gender binary. In other words, science tied gender and racial hierarchies into sexual acts to mark some love as central to modern life and other love as that which dare not speak its name. To be clear, it was never just homosexuality that had to be silenced, but any sex that was commercial, public, interracial, polygamous, masturbatory, and or intergenerational. Sex outside reproductive, private, married, dyadic couples was marked as primitive, degenerate, and therefore not fully white. Because modern ideas about romance first developed among the ruling classes to mark some love as worthwhile and other love as perverse, romance was always an ideology that privileged the sexual ruling elites. Which brings us to our next fact. Romance has always been intimately tied to citizenship. As Margot Canaday says in The Straight State, quote, unlike comparable European states, which were well established before sexologists discovered the homosexual, the American bureaucracy matured during the same years that scientific and popular awareness of the pervert exploded on the American consciousness, end quote. In other words, in order to be a good American citizen, one did not just need to be male and white, but also straight and married. Like the proverbial bootstraps, the heartstrings of romantic citizenship were never provided equally to everyone. For instance, the GI Bill is often discussed as a form of federal funding, a form of welfare for white soldiers. But those soldiers also had to be straight and married. Any white soldiers who received blue papers for suspicion of being gay were not allowed to access these loans. So it was that by the 20th century, romance became a form of class, gender, and race warfare, as well as the central project of the nation state. And most people didn't even notice. Instead, Americans bought Valentine's Day cards and the newly mass-produced paperback romance novels with their hard-earned dollars. Soon enough, a new form of romantic propaganda came along, the cinema, and it got Americans young. In 1937, Disney released Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and an entire generation of true romantics was born. Snow White and other Disney films taught Americans that love is all you need, but only beautiful, young, well-off, normatively gendered white characters get true love always. These cinematic representations of love continue to be represented in the actual marriage rates in the US. For instance, 56% of whites are married, but only 30% of Black Americans. 80% of wealthy Americans are married, but for the first time, most Americans are not married. Of course, recent romantic cultural productions like the Twilight series and 50 Shades continue to teach us surprisingly similar lessons to Snow White. Like Snow White and Cinderella, Twilight and 50 Shades are more economic fantasies than they are romantic ones. Young, incredibly ordinary girls who would be condemned to a life of drudgery and economic precariousness are saved by white and incredibly wealthy men. If you know the Twilight series, you know that Bella, the teenage heroine at the center of them, had only a high school degree and was a teenage mother. The chances of her earning a livable wage, in other words, being able to pay rent and buy food, were pretty slim. In 50 Shades, which is structured on the Twilight series, it began as a fan fiction, but vampirism is replaced with BDSM as the secret which the heroine must keep. Anastasia Steele graduates from Washington State, Vancouver, with a BA in English, not necessarily the most lucrative major. Also, the average student at Washington State, Vancouver usually takes more than 4 years to graduate and has a debt load of about $28,000. It's highly doubtful that Anastasia Steele would have been able to move to Seattle and afford a place to live, let alone have lived in this penthouse pictured here in the Escala building, which sold for $11.5 million. In these stories, Twilight and 50 Shades, men of color, in one case, a native Indian person and the other a Latino, are both poor and potential rapists. It doesn't matter whether it's BDSM or vampirism. A girl can put up with anything if it means her white prince will save her from sexual violence and a life of poverty. You might think these aren't the most important cultural texts to look at, but in fact, Twilight sold 116 million books and was translated into 37 languages. Its 5 films grossed about $3.4 billion, making it one of the top grossing movie franchises in the world, just behind the Harry Potter series, and more popular than the Star Trek movies. And 50 Shades sold 10 million copies in 6 weeks. It remains one of the top 5 best-selling books of all time. Hopefully by now you understand why I'm so interested in romance as an ideology, intimately connected to both capitalism and citizenship. But the real argument of my book begins in 1980, when a handsome Hollywood type swept many Americans off their feet and ushered in a new type of capitalism, and with it, an explosion in the importance of romance. On January 20th, 1981, Reagan took office and set in motion a series of neoliberal economic reforms, colloquially referred to as trickle-down economics or Reaganomics. The promise of trickle-down economics is that money will be given to the wealthiest in the form of tax cuts and money taken away from the poorest in terms of cutting social programs, and then the wealth would trickle down to everyone. As you can see from the infographic of wine glasses, it did not work out that way. Between 1980 and 2005, most Americans became poorer, and the rich became much richer. And that was before the Great Recession of 2008. Instead of focusing on the radical redistribution of wealth in the US, a country where 10% of the population now controls over 75% of the wealth, making the US more unequal than India, Russia, and South Africa, we pine over love or go to couples therapy to work on our relationship. The 25% of the wealth left to be divvied up by the remaining 90% of us is hardly randomly distributed. Whites continue to earn about 1.7 and 1.5 times what Black and Latino Americans earn. Women still earn 82% of what men earn, and that has changed little over the past decade. But instead of focusing on the actual effects of trickle-down economics, we were too busy fantasizing about the biggest wedding of the 20th century. 7 months after Reagan took office, on July 29th, 1981, Charles, Prince of Wales, and Lady Diana Spencer got married in the most fairy tale of weddings. 750 million people watched it around the world. If only that many had paid attention to Reagan and his British soulmate, Margaret Thatcher. Instead of paying attention to Thatcher, Reagan, trickle-down economics, we were too focused on the 25-foot train of Princess Di's ivory taffeta wedding dress and her poofy princess sleeves, and how dashing Prince Charles looked in his full naval attire, complete with white gloves and gold braid. In fact, the two looked like Prince Charming and Cinderella. Speaking of Disney, the corporation managed to turn itself around at the end of the 1980s from a not terribly profitable company to one of the most profitable by reinvigorating romance as its genre of choice. After not so great sales of its far less romantic films like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and Oliver and Company, Disney went back to its romantic roots. In 1989, it hit the jackpot with The Little Mermaid and Pretty Woman. According to press reports, earnings from the movie shot up 34.5%, and on sales of video cassettes, 56.8%. And if you don't know what a video cassette is, you can Google it. In Pretty Woman, a sex worker becomes worthy of the love of a wealthy John as romance transforms them into a princess and prince. Let me read you some of the description of the movie. Academy Award winner Julia Roberts and Golden Globe winner Richard Gere will leave you breathless in Pretty Woman. Vivian is a spirited, streetwise diamond in the rough when she meets shrewd, no-nonsense billionaire Edward. It's a chance encounter that turns the weekend business arrangement into a timeless rags to riches romance. Fall in love all over again with this as this contemporary Cinderella story unfolds before your eyes. End quote. Both these stories, Little Mermaid and Pretty Woman, demand, like all of romance, a suspension of reality. Billionaires don't fall in love with sex workers and marry them. Mermaids don't exist, and if they did, would they really want to be human? And in the suspension of reality, we were lured into ignoring the material in order to engage in the fantasy and wish fulfillment of romance. In the last few decades, since Reagan's presidency, and as a radical redistribution of wealth has taken place, Americans have turned more and more to a belief in romance, even as we've gotten married less and less. Like all love stories, the one between capitalism and romance seems overdetermined. At the exact historical moment when financial opportunities were shut down by low wages, higher education fell out of reach for most young people, even as it remained the best guarantee of joining the middle class, and the economy was completely transformed from an industrial one with livable wages into a service one with minimum wages, romance came onto the scene with a vengeance, and our belief in it seems to grow with each passing year. During the holiday season of 2017, nuclear war rhetoric between Donald Trump and North Korea was heating up. At the same time, raging fires in California and the polar vortex in the rest of the country were making life miserable. So what did Americans do? We turned to the feel-good programming of the Hallmark channel. Hallmark is the fourth most watched channel in the country and has more viewers than MSNBC and about the same number as CNN. At the Hallmark channel, you can watch formulaic romance after formulaic romance, not unlike the canned sentiments Hallmark cards are known for. This year, when COVID locked Americans down in March, romance novel sales jumped by more than 11%, and romantic comedy books in print rose 188%. It's just that ability to create little bubbles of oxygen in suffocating times that makes romance such a powerful force. Together, romance and capitalism conspire to create a smokescreen of fairy dust that blinded most of us to the material world just when we should have been paying closer attention. And part of that smokescreen has been even made thicker with social media. Today, for instance, nearly all wedding engagements are staged and made spectacular and shared on various social media platforms such as YouTube and Facebook. The strange mix of extreme competition and highly publicized private emotions is how nearly all couples are getting engaged in the 21st century. No longer satisfied with a private conversation or even the private ritual of getting on bended knee, young couples now want a spectacular engagement, a set of extremely theatrical gestures that are then translated into highly produced images consumed by millions of onlookers. During my research, I interviewed 16 couples at wedding expos throughout North America about how they got engaged, and most of them had some sort of spectacular engagement. For instance, I interviewed a young white couple. He was 36 and a physical therapist, she 28 and a speech therapist, who loved to run ultramarathons together. At an ultramarathon in 2014, he worked with race organizers so that her bib had "marry me" on it rather than numbers. Unfortunately for him, her competitive nature overruled any inner romantic because she did not want to start the race late. Rather than letting the photographers take pictures of the engagement, she rushed off to the starting line. The couple laughed about how their big moment was not documented in any way they could share. He shrugged his shoulders and said, "At least it's a good story." Another young man I interviewed planned the proposal with tickets to Disney in his pocket. He popped his question and they were on a plane to Florida a couple of hours later to celebrate in style. Another young man proposed at Disney. On Christmas Eve, he brought his girlfriend onto the balcony at the Magic Kingdom. As they looked out at Cinderella's castle, the Christmas tree shimmered and the giant toy train set whirred by as he dropped to one knee. Other proposals of couples I interviewed took place on romantic weekends, at the site of their first date, on top of a mountain, during a Christmas Eve slideshow, or in Washington Square Park. None of these were as spectacular as the engagements seen on YouTube or BuzzFeed. There were no flash mobs, there were no marching bands, and there weren't 3 different levels of camera, let alone musical, live music as part of them. But all of these couples understood that engagements could no longer just involve a conversation. Most importantly, the man must spend money and time to create a story that is out of a romance novel, or at least out of a romantic comedy, so that the couples can retell their story of their engagement over and over again. In this ritualistic retelling, their love is performed as magical, enchanted, and fated. Of course, after the spectacular proposal, they had to plan the perfect wedding. Spending on weddings has increased since 1980, even as getting married has become less popular. Of the couples getting married whom I interviewed, nearly all of whom had a university education and nearly all of whom had debt from this education, they were still taking out more debt for their weddings. So the educational debt ranged from $15,000 to $100,000 per couple. And they were taking out somewhere in the range of $10,000 to $60,000 more for their weddings. When I asked them why they would take out more debt, they said because they wanted to do it right. And right meant perfect. Most of these young couples seem to believe that by investing in a wedding, they will be guaranteed a stable marriage and, by extension, a stable future. Despite the fact that a recent study shows that the cost of the wedding might be inversely related to the length of the marriage, these young people had already invested a lot into their romance. They had bought the diamond ring, staged elaborate proposals, and were now shopping for the perfect wedding cake and the best DJ at the wedding expos where I interviewed them. They were extremely hopeful that they were making the right decisions. This is where the marriage of romance and capitalism draws its strength. By promising us a better world at some future point, if we are willing to sacrifice now. We are being sold hope in increasingly hopeless times, and we are buying it like never before. And yet, somehow, it's not making us happy. Even as the United States economy improved after the end of the Great Recession in 2009, happiness among adults continued to decline, a trend that has been going on since at least 2000. And what do we do when we are unhappy? We turn to romance. It's a trap. But romance is not just a trap. As I hope I've made clear, it's also an escape valve. Many of us desperately turn to romance right now because the promise of romance makes life more bearable. Like a good glass of wine, romance allows us to go on another day without giving up. It's not that we're dupes of this ideology, but we are rather willing users of romance in order to survive. In this way, romance does the emotional labor that neoliberal global capitalism cannot. It gives us hope. It gives us optimism. And yet, as Lauren Berlant points out, optimism can be cruel. Cruel optimism, quote, ignites a sense of possibility, yet actually makes it impossible to attain the transformation for which a person or a people risk striving. And doubly cruel, such that a person or a world finds itself bound to a situation of profound threat that is at the same time profoundly confirming, end quote. It is that profound threat and yet romance as profoundly confirming that has mobilized us, that has allowed us to use this cruel optimism when what we need is realism. And realism demands that we no longer privatize our futures by searching for our own personal happy ever after, but we collectivize our resources to survive environmental destruction, religious fundamentalism, and the seemingly inevitable concentration of resources in the hands of the few. We don't really need fairy tales. We need global movements. And yet, for many of us, we cannot shake this hopeful feeling that our true love awaits us. I will end on this. I went to the wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton. Well, not the wedding, but I was outside with a million people who were also outside. And I interviewed a lot of people there, all of whom were aware that most people are getting poorer, while a few have been getting much richer. They were also aware of the dangers of war without end and the looming environmental crisis. And yet they were there at the wedding of the 21st century in the crush of a million other romantics. Two white 30-something stay-at-home moms from Huntington who had taken the train down to London for the big day told me that they were there for this dream of a better tomorrow. Quote, this girl, Kate Middleton, is becoming a princess today, and that's part of it. I wonder what she thought this morning when she got up and shaved her legs, like, oh, I'm becoming a princess. Kate grew up normal. Everyone dreams of marrying a prince. We all dream about it, even though we know it's not true, end quote. So I asked, but if we know it's not true, then why is it romantic? The woman pointed to some friends who had come down with them. In the group were two little girls, 7 and 9 years old, dressed as fairy princesses, tiaras and all. See them? That's why it's romantic, she answered. We insist on being hopeless and we insist on being hopeful in hopeless times. But I hope by now I have convinced you that romance, like trickle-down economics, will not make us better off, nor will romance save us from global pandemics and environmental collapse. It turns out that in the end, love is not all we need. Thank you.
I'd like to open up the floor if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask of Laurie, or you can also put things in the chat if there are anything that anyone would like to ask.
You know, Hollywood and Disney, you know, it has a global reach. Do these messages play different in different cultures?
So the culture I'm most familiar with is Russia, because it's someplace I spend a lot of time and teach there occasionally. And it does play differently, right? So because the particular version of global neoliberal economics is slightly different there, I think the notion of a privatized future is increasingly popular, but the idea that one gets there through romance is not particularly strong, which is not to say that they don't watch The Crown, because people do. But I will just go to if I can just go to that moment when Prince Di and Charles were getting married and it wasn't real. But of course, here's a fact. Probably most royal weddings aren't real. Just an idea, not sure. But people really believe them. And so when I was in the crowd the day of, I interviewed people the 2 days leading up to Kate and William's wedding and then the day of. So I managed to interview quite a bunch of people who were camping out, who were really dedicated to seeing Kate and William's wedding. Some of them had been at Charles and Diana's wedding. And if the people were over 50, they found their romance more compelling generally because he was strong and manly, and she was young and virginal, and they found that a very compelling story. Whereas people under 50 tended to find Kate and William a more compelling story because they were quote unquote equals, and she was a year older than him, and they had similar levels of education. So I think you can see shifts in romance. So that's like a kind of effect of feminism, I think, on romance. At the same time, there's still a total belief that this is real, and somehow Kate and William getting married is going to create a bright future for England or the UK, which turns out to not have been any more true than it was previously, right? But that real belief that if we just have the right royal wedding, either the truly Disney-like Prince and young virginal Diana, or the more equal feminist one of Kate and William, then somehow UK will be okay. Even though people knew it wasn't true, right? I think we're all romantics and cynics, and certainly at the wedding of William and Kate, that was true. Certainly, I am a romantic and a cynic, right? Like I think we all know that whatever's happening in the Crown may or may not be true, and whatever's happening in at the actual wedding may or may not be true. But we want to believe, right? We wanted to believe that somehow Diana and Charles had a chance, even though you know how it ends, right?
I had a question. I found that, starting off early in life, like all those Disney stories certainly impressed upon me, like what the gender role was for a heterosexual relationship. And I definitely came out of, early adulthood, or came into early adulthood thinking, the female role in a heterosexual relationship tended to be around things like attachment and tenderness. And what I found as now, another quarter of a lifetime through, is that it seems to be flipped like really frequently. And I just wonder how men would be missing out, heterosexual men are missing out in this, like it kind of, we pretty much sell romance to women, the book series and things. And I wonder about that differentiation and what is romance to men versus what is romance to women, and what gets sold to them.
Yeah, I think if you look at it realistically, mostly women consume romance novels, rom-coms, Disney films. Girls consume Disney films, and boys and men don't, right? I mean, they consume action films and porn, lots and lots of porn. And I think in some ways the porn romance juxtaposition is an interesting one, because both of them are clearly shaping how we see the world and how we're going to engage in our relationships. Not necessarily in a one-to-one way, but they're having an effect. What I did find with the men I interviewed, and this was particularly true, in Florida, Disney is the number one location for honeymoons in the continental US. I guess Hawaii probably is in the larger US, but in the continental US, Disney is. And so I was able to interview a lot of people on their honeymoon there. They were all heterosexual, and all except one of them were white. They were college educated, they were professionals. And the men had really interesting stories. So for them, Disney was an important part of their ability to be a romantic subject. Like they felt as if Disney taught them not to be cruel, not to actually care about a woman, to actually think of love as important. So they all had favorite Disney films. And in particular, they liked Aladdin a lot as a figure to sort of emulate, which was interesting, right? Of romance having this sort of interesting and potentially positive effect on what could have been quite toxic masculinity, which I guess just goes to show how romance is contradictory, right? Like all ideologies, it's contradictory. So the men there definitely felt like Disney had made them better men, better partners, better heterosexual partners in their relationships. It's also just confusing that couples would go there, right? I mean, that was the part that I couldn't get. It was, I went in July, admittedly, so that was probably bad, but it was hotter than hell. And there were all these like screaming children and people in motorized chairs. And there was just like nothing romantic about it. I was like, what is romantic about this? But I think what it offered them being at Disney or being at the Epcot Center was this fantasy of total safety and control. So a lot of people go to Epcot at night and they quote unquote drink around the world. And they're like, yeah, it's like you can go to Paris and Berlin all in the same, and China all in the same night, and it's it's completely safe. And so it's this fantasy of being enclosed in this bubble of romance. I mean, it's probably not really safe, right? It's probably as dangerous as anywhere else, I would assume. But they have this fantasy that because it's Disney, it's safe, it's controlled. None of the problems of the real world will come inside. There's always someone to take care of things. And if you know anything about Disney, you know that they actually have all these mechanisms they use, so you don't ever see the labor people are doing to make the magic happen, right? Like it's built above ground. People, if they're too hot and they're passing out in their costumes or whatever, they're supposed to just lie down, and then this Disneyfied ambulance corps comes up and like takes them downstairs, so you don't have to see anyone like getting rehydrated in these incredibly hot costumes, or right. So Disney does create this fantasy of love solving everything, and then also I think there's a lot of white nostalgia in it, right? For this place where it's so centered on this fantasy of like Main Street USA, where there's no, and it's also a Southern Main Street USA, right? And there's no tensions, and it's all without any conflict. And so I also did some research in Celebration, which is it's not a gated community, but it's a design community designed by Disney. Disney doesn't own it anymore, but they designed it. And what I found there, it was a very similar idea. People moved there because they love this idea of everything being taken care of, everything being safe. And they would say, this one white woman told me that, even the police are here, they're everywhere, but they're keeping us safe, and they're in plain clothes. And so you don't know who they are, but they're keeping us safe, which I thought was really startling, because it was, it's maybe 40 minutes from where Trayvon Martin was killed, but it was this total white nostalgia for some imaginary past that never existed, where everyone was without the troubles of the real world. And so to me, the honeymooners at Disney and the people living in Celebration were all engaging in a pretty similar nostalgia that didn't quite work, right? So, they kind of, like at Celebration, there's all sorts of problems, right? Like there's global warming, and there are these giant hurricanes, and people, and the kids across the interstate have been shipped into the school because it's a public school, and they have serious chronic hunger problems. And so the parents, who are not horrible people, are like organizing food drives to send in the kids backpacks on the weekend so they're not hungry. So they often described it as being in a bubble, but there were always, it was like the Truman Show, if you've ever seen that they use that metaphor a lot, that it was a bubble and they were safe, but like the real world kept popping in and they wished it wouldn't.
Yeah, I guess maybe a comment or a question. It's just that the function of innocence or manufactured innocence, or innocence being a construct in the way that whiteness is a construct. I mean, it kind of seems like that's a through line a little bit of what you're talking about with the romance movies and also the Disney, Celebration.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Ryan. Another course I teach besides heterosexuality is called White People. And one of the things we think about a lot in there is the construction of the child in the 1800s alongside romance. And the child is always constructed as white and blonde and blue-eyed and cherubic, et cetera. And how that also created Black children as imagined as insensate to pain, as easily consumed, right? So if you look at the advertisements from the 1800s, there's often a Black child who's being consumed by an alligator, and that's meant to sell you licorice drops or something, right? Like, or Little Sambo, or all those cartoons where a Black child is often consumed, eaten, hurt in some way, but that's imagined as unimportant because that innocence isn't extended to Black children. So yeah, certainly without a doubt, romance and weddings remain central to the project of white supremacy. I mean, there's just little, even though also they do other things. I mean, I'm not saying that's all they do, but that is part of what they do.
Are there sort of alternate examples from other cinema? Like I'm thinking specifically from Black cinema, Latinx cinema, or even, maybe there's even mainstream alternatives to the fairy tale.
I mean, there are, right? They're just not as popular, right? I mean, I just can't think of one that's, when you think about the power of something like the Twilight series and 50 Shades of Grey and just how popular they were, what compares? I mean, I guess we could say some of the other young adult novels do, but even they end up being kind of romances. Like, think about Harry Potter, right? It all ends with everybody in a heterosexual dyadic couple sending their kids off, reproducing class privilege in the school system. Off to Hogwarts they go. Even the sort of bad guy whose name I'm forgetting, but he was like the blonde son of the
Malfoy.
Malfoy, thank you. Even Malfoy is married and reproductive at the end. In fact, the only one who dies is the one character that's posited as gay, Dumbledore, right? So even those other young adult series, not that 50 Shades was young adults, teenagers, please don't read it unless you're over a certain age. But even those other young adult series sort of have romance as this running theme in them, even that might not be the central tenet. So I'm trying to think of one. Maybe you can think of one that's equally as popular.
I like your answer that it exists. They are out there. They're not as prevalent.
Right. And they're usually made with people who have a critical sense of the work that romance is doing as an ideology, even if it's not the primary reason for creating that art. They have a sense that maybe that might not be true. I guess I'm thinking about a lot of the novels I read, or, which aren't romance novels. But people read romance novels. I mean, look at Stacey Abrams, who clearly knows what the heck is going on in the world. I mean, she writes romance novels, and people read them, and that's not bad. I think what's bad is if we imagine that it's true, that it will really save us.
I think those are such interesting points that you're bringing up, Laurie, and I'm really struggling to mentally come up with an answer to Ryan's question about whether or not these same themes or tropes emerge in other in the culture and other cultures. If you want to say like cultural mythology, fairy tales, like whatever is happening there, and I'm struggling. And so the only thing I could think of was, this is so dark, but like Octavia Butler's books, and thinking about the young female heroine, and she does begin a relationship, but that relationship isn't even it's something that she, to a certain extent, is eschewing in the parable books. And so that is very interesting, and really I think underscores what you've said about the reproduction of whiteness in our culture through through innocence, through romance, through childhood. All of those things really seem to be reserved for white people. And I'm also thinking about Hallmark movies because it's that time. But I've noticed that this year, I don't know if this is just what we are seeing in our culture, is that there are more Hallmark movies being advertised this year with people of color, but they're still exactly the same story. It's still, young woman moves back to small town, handsome widower comes to split wood for her, oh my, he's so manly, and they happily ever after, and it's snowing, right? So that is so interesting, and I just think such a great point. And now I'm thinking through my bookshelves, my DVD collection, my iTunes, everything that has romance in it that purports to not be white and normative kind of is. So an interesting point.
Yeah, and I think I admit I haven't watched as many of the Hallmark movies as I should have, but I think that ability to sort of change out, it's like the Bachelor and Bachelorette franchise, which mostly is white, but occasionally you might put, especially after they were sued for never having a black bachelor, you could put a black bachelor in, but you can swap them out, or like Aladdin, right? There's non-white characters at the center of that romance. It's also true that they're white looking, their features are white, and the bad guy, Jafar, his features are more Semitic, right? He has a hook nose, he has a longer elongated face, right? So I think sometimes when you see romance producing those narratives like, oh, this is all inclusive, it's often by whitening up the characters. Or imagining like a post-racial future or something, right? But Disney's very good at making the bad guys racially other. And the Little Mermaid, Ursula is a different species. She's some sort of octopus or something, right? I mean, and she's gray, and all the other mermaids are, white person colored, right? So,
right. Just building on that, you reminded me of a question I had while you were talking about Aladdin. What's your feeling on why Aladdin is the favorite of men? And I think I have a potential theory just about, Aladdin and his class and maybe it feeling more, accessible, but I'd really be interested in your thoughts about that.
it seemed to be the movie for the men I interviewed that seemed to focus more on Aladdin's feeling than Jasmine's. I don't know. What were you thinking?
Well, I was thinking that in the other Disney films, and they are all heteronormative, but that the mythology, the fairy tale, seems more for female viewers who are like, oh, I'm just very like Kate Middleton or Diana Spencer, like I'm just a regular girl and I'm going about my business, and then this like rich, handsome, charming, fantastic prince comes along and he makes it all better. But with Aladdin, he's marrying into a royal family through marriage to a woman, and I'm just always been curious about like what that looks like, and whether or not there are other films or other fairy tales and other cultures where the man is the person that's being elevated through marriage socially.
Right. We don't even have a term for it, right? It's the Cinderella story, right? Because that's so common. And then Aladdin is the Cinderella in this.
Right. Like I'm thinking of even like references to college basketball, Final Four, like when a team comes out of nowhere, they're like, oh, they're the Cinderella team of this year's whatever. There isn't. You're right. There's not anything that is male per se to reflect what that story even is. It's almost like it doesn't exist.
Right. And then when we see people who are more similar economic status, like Anastasia Steele and Jorge, the photographer, I believe is his name, in 50 Shades, they're actually similar, right? They went to college together, they grew up together, their parents are friends. She can't marry him because he's not going to have money, right? Like it's not even a possibility. And the same in Twilight, right? The Native American friend Jacob, who again, they're friends, their parents are friends, etc. But he's not even in the running, right? Because he's not rich.
I was struck by your chart of how the marriage, the weddings, the cost of weddings, just going up, and I can't help but reflect. It's like, perhaps some people this year becoming aware of the societal cost of maintaining an illusion, right? And like this is like an actual graph of this is what it costs to maintain this illusion, and it's getting more expensive the more that the actual reality is in contradiction to that.
Yeah, it's really amazing. And that I think the average wedding, I obviously don't have 2020 data, but I think for 2019 was 38,000. And you compare that to what the average Black family of four earns, or even the average white family of four, it's pretty out of reach for most people. And then in urban areas, it's often triple that. So you can, if you're going to get married in New York City, plan on $95,000, $100,000. So it is interesting to see. I mean, talk about a fetish in a way, right? So people spend more and more money on weddings, even as fewer and fewer Americans are getting married. It's like this strange, I don't know how to explain it except to say that weddings have become a kind of fetishistic ritual with these fetishistic items, and that don't really have any relationship to the everyday world anymore. Even how much you pay for a wedding dress is completely imaginary, right? Like you can't go to one wedding shop and compare the same dress at another wedding shop. Or if you've ever watched Say Yes to the Dress, you know that you're not supposed to really care about the cost because it's your special day and you need to not think about that. And this is fantasy land. Same with engagement rings, right? Engagement rings diamonds are basically worthless. I mean, that is a sad fact. They're industrial. They have an industrial use. They're a dime a dozen, as it were. But But because De Beers convinced Americans that they needed diamonds for a wedding, which they only did, by the way, in the 1940s. It was the 1940s when people started giving diamond rings, in part because De Beers had this great advertisement of a diamond is forever. And they convinced people you have to have a diamond to get married. And they put it in the movies. They paid movie stars to wear diamonds. They paid movie producers to put it in scripts. They had all these educational seminars for men on how to buy a wedding. You had to spend 1 month's salary on it. Later, they changed that to 2 months' salary. Completely made up. It's like completely made up by the diamond industry. But at some level, it doesn't matter because we believe it so thoroughly that nearly all engagements, over 90% of them in the US, have a diamond ring. Even though you can say to people say, oh yeah, I know it was made up by De Beers. I still want one. Or as I always say, teaching sociology of heterosexuality clearly shows that when an ideology is hegemonic, there's no way out of it, because everyone who takes my class will have a big white wedding with a diamond ring and invite me to it. And then I'll go and cry, by the way. That's how hegemony works.
Absolutely. Wow. Those were fantastic thoughts. I'm going to be thinking about that, looking at every person's hand that I walk past today. I actually was looking at my own. I actually have moissanite, which is another interesting like diamond facsimile-ish thing, because even though I was like, oh, I don't want a diamond, except I wanted to look like a diamond. So, how can I be socially just and, a womanist and still have something that looks sparkly? So, Laurie, that was really fantastic. And I am so appreciative of the time that you spent with us today. I think this was an excellent talk, and especially as we near the end of 2020 and how difficult this has been and how we've all been watching, this as well, what romance as fantasy looks like and escapism looks like. And I just think it was so relevant and so wonderful. So again, thank you so much on behalf of the Humanities Council, and we appreciate your time with us.